Good day. Welcome to yet another of our Ransford's weekly wraps. I'm Viv Governor, and what we're going to do as usual is go through a few stories of the week that affect you and your investments going forward, as well as wrap up with a bit of an AI talk at the end, or tech talk at the end. This week we're going to discuss a couple topics. Firstly, SA GDP, then the G20. Next, oil prices. Those are going to be our topical stories of the week. And then finally, in our AI segment, I'm going to talk a bit more about Falcon AI, which is a new open source AI model released from the Middle East. Okay, let's just look at the main stories of the week. So starting off with SA GDP. SA GDP came in at about 0.6% for the last quarter. That is much better than the 0.1% expected, showing that the South African economy seems to be weathering the storm of load shedding and a number of other factors, such as, for instance, the issues of Transnet, etc., reasonably well, better than the market had been expecting. Now, why is this important? Firstly, I've been predicting this for a while. I was saying, even last year, that what's happening in South Africa is a bifurcation. There are people and companies with money, and what they are doing is basically insulating themselves from Eskom. So you look at the retailers that have come out, and they've talked about the fact that 80+% of them, some of their stores are now on independent power supply. You look at the larger factories out there, larger companies out there in the economy, and any of them that are profitable, even any of them that are viable, increasing the amount of solar and other independent power generation projects that they have in order to insulate themselves from load shedding. This week, load shedding went up to level 6 again. For those who don't know, level 6 now means roughly 10 hours a day of no power. This is obviously a bit of disappointment coming through, especially because some of the statements we got from government like a few weeks ago were saying that we've gone through the worst of load shedding and things should be getting better. But we're back at level 6, and according to Cyril Ramaphosa, this might be a good thing. Let me not talk more about that, but it remains an ongoing problem in the country. And it's worse than you think, because remember, all the stuff that companies and people are doing individually should have taken about one level of load shedding out, because that supply, that extra amount of solar or whatever energy people are putting into their companies or their homes takes that load away from Eskom. So Eskom should actually, all else being equal, have been significantly better off because of the stuff coming through. Unfortunately, the situation continues to deteriorate at Eskom. So despite the fact that they've effectively had a whole stage worth of load shedding, or maybe a bit more than that, added over the last couple of years by the private sector, we still have level 6 at the moment. And I do think that the problem here is multifold. So firstly, if we have the wealthiest people and the most solvent companies removing themselves from the danger of load shedding, it's not that far a thing from just effectively getting away from load shedding to getting away entirely from Eskom, especially as Eskom continues to deteriorate, which means that Eskom loses its best customers that basically pay their bills, that don't have arrears in terms of their accounts. At the same time, what it does mean also is that Eskom now becomes more reliant on raising its funding from the people that are left behind, people that don't have the ability to basically get solar and other stuff at their homes, or don't, as the companies, have the ability to go and get themselves off the grid, which generally are going to be companies and people that have worse credit records, worse ability to pay, which is going to make Eskom even more financially vulnerable going forward. It also, of course, is going to raise the perspective of inequality in South Africa, which remains the world's most unequal country. When you have a certain segment of the population going to be, effectively insulated from the collapse of the energy grid, and others are going to be feeling the full brunt of it. Okay, so that is obviously a problem. But in terms of GDP, obviously the most productive people and the most well-paid people are going to be the most that add the most to GDP, and same thing with the companies. And so it kind of makes sense that we are not seeing the same impact on GDP numbers from load shedding as we saw last year, for instance. Even though load shedding this year has been, to some extent, worse than last year, at least this far until the year. Next thing we're going to talk is about the G20. The G20 is a grouping of the world's basically 19 most powerful nations, plus the European Union as a group. Okay, they're going to be part of the G20. There is talk, a couple of things to be discussed. Firstly, there is a very strong rumor, and I think by the time you guys watch this, it might already be confirmed, that the African Union is going to be joining the G20 kind of like how the European Union joined the G20. So there's European countries, there's France, there's Germany, etc. in the G20, but there's also Europe as a whole. The European Union as a whole is part of the G20. And so I expect, even if there's an African Union joining the G20, we could have South Africa being a separate country, or maybe perhaps part of it as well. It would not make sense to have South Africa as part of the G20 when we don't have, for instance, like Nigeria, which is a larger economy than ours at the moment, in that grouping. So it's good news. I mean, I think having Africa having a seat at the table is very important. It is the fastest growing continent in terms of population. It is one of the best prospects for future growth in the world, and I think it also has the world's poorest people as well, which indicates that it's good to have the poorest in the world having a seat at the table of these powerful nations. The other big story in the G20 is the fact that China decided to skip. Xi Jinping, rather, not China, but Xi Jinping decided to skip this meeting. Now, there's a couple of possible reasons for this. Maybe he's trying to indicate that he thinks BRICS is more important than the G20. Or maybe he's basically dealing with some local or national crisis at the moment, or some issues at home that he thinks he can't take his eye off the ball, or there isn't a possibility that he's ill. I mean, there has been rumors of his illness over the last couple of years, and apparently there was talk that he might have something wrong with his brain, or maybe some cancer or something like that. And there was many rumors of the last couple of years about him. China being as close as it is, we may never know the exact reason for this, but it's interesting to note that he's missed this particular meeting. Now, the G20 is basically most of the world. It's around about 85% of the world's GDP. So out of the G20, there's 15% of the world's GDP. So it's by far the majority of the world's economy. It's also the majority of the world's population as well, about 2/3 of the world's population, obviously made up majority of by India and China. That's why BRICS, because only has India and China and a couple other countries, is about 47% of the world's population. Because both those countries have 1+ billion people, and nobody else has 500 million people. So these countries are both, each of them 3 times larger than any other country, more than 3 times larger, in fact about 4 times larger than the next country, which I think is the US. So in terms of population, 2/3 of the population, in terms of economy, 85% of the world's GDP. So it's pretty much the gathering of the world, except for the smaller nations out there. But like I said in the last little thing about BRICS on its own is not an insignificant entity. It is about 1/3 of global GDP and about 47% of global population. And in fact, if you add up the new countries, the Saudi Arabia's, Iran's, etc., that's going to be added to BRICS, it gets close to 50% of the world's population, and over a third of global GDP as well. So it's not an insignificant body. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that China is trying to play the card of trying to up BRICS and kind of push down the G20. And speaking of China, just one little thing I want to add here. We are seeing developments in China recently around tech, around chip design. I've been telling you for a while now that the Chinese have been cut off from the really high-end chips made in the West, both in terms of importing the chips as well as basically the machinery to make any kind of lower-end chips as well. Now, what happened this week was you had Huawei come out with its latest latest phone basically, and that phone uses a chip that is not that far away from the absolute cutting edge that we see in the West today. It's a couple of years behind, but not as far behind as you would have thought. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this could indicate that the Chinese are really putting a lot of effort into bridging that gap in terms of their technical ability around computer chips, which is a huge issue in terms of global trade. Also, it could indicate that maybe there has been some breaching of the sanctions that allows China to do this. So again, we don't know exactly what's the situation yet. These things are often complicated, but it's interesting that China is pushing up in terms of its own independence from the global, at least the Western technological supply chain. And finally, we're looking at oil. Oil prices, Brent crude prices this week breached $90 a barrel. In South Africa, $90 a barrel, plus the fact that we see the rand at about 19 to the US dollar, does indicate to me that we are going to have some return of inflation in South Africa. The last little reading we had was pretty much almost at a target level of the midpoint of 3 to 6. Unfortunately, if we see oil prices as high as this, the rand as weak as this, I do think that inflation is going to make a bit of a comeback, which I think would be quite negative for the country. The Reserve Bank is going to have a great bit of difficulty basically trying to cut interest rates while we are seeing inflation, slightly above expectation, slightly above the target range and possibly rising. Which would mean that, obviously some of the pain that we're seeing recently with, high interest rates in terms of, repaying bonds, repaying, car loans and, other kind of debt, could remain for a bit longer in South Africa. And I think that is something that we need to be concerned about. Hopefully, these are pretty volatile, commodities, and hopefully oil prices do come back down again. But to give an idea, I mean, a few months ago, we were seeing the oil price at about, $72 a barrel for Brent crude oil. Now it's 90. It's more than a 20% increase in terms of pricing. At the same time, the rand has weakened from about 1730, 1740 at the end of July to where I'm speaking to you right now in the first week or so of September, where it's about 1920, 1915. That's a significant change. It's about 2 rands, also about more than 20% in terms of weakening there as well. If inflation does return to South Africa, I think we won't be the only ones. I think the oil price being as high as it is in dollar terms, remember, not just in rand terms, is going to have an impact around the world, especially in the European Union. Remember, the European Union last year kind of escaped the worst of the oil prices, the gas price, etc., because the winter was warmer than expected. We can't rely on that happening again this year. Should this be an exceptionally cold, even as colder than average winter in the EU, I think there's going to be a lot of the pain that we expected last year coming this year. I think you are going to find, natural gas prices. I think you are going to find energy prices, rocket up again. I think you are going to find, rationing and possibly, some of the manufacturing being shut down, to use that energy instead to heat homes and so on. So it's a bit of a unknown at the moment, but I do think that inflation is by no means over, and I think the market's trying to realize it at the moment. Now, finally, the part where we talk about our little tech segment of the day, I want to cover, AI. I want to cover, as usual, what's happened in the last couple of days. So there's been a new AI model released from the Middle East called Falcon. Okay, Falcon is right now the largest open source AI model out there. It's not totally open source. That means you can't use it for anything. But, if you can experiment it, you can work with it. But if there's some commercial usage getting out here, there's some restrictions on that. Now, what's important about this is that the rate of change. It's been less than a month or so since we've got, Llama 2 from Facebook, about a month or so maybe. And this model has come out. This model is twice as large as Llama 2 from Facebook. In about a month or so, double the size of the largest open source model available. It is roughly, it's a bit bigger than GPT 3.5. It's not quite as big as GPT 4, but it's significantly bigger than any other open source model out there. What's important about this is that we are seeing progress continue to go incredibly fast in the AI space. And a lot of the stuff that we thought were gatekeepers to this particular technology are not there. This particular model was released, like I said, from the Middle East. You've all heard about Ronaldo playing in Saudi Arabia, and we've all heard about Mbappe getting, this offered $1 billion, and Messi getting offered over $1 billion as well to go play in the Middle East, in the Gulf states. You think this is in order to basically build up, a local sports league. You think governments that are willing to spend that kind of money on sports stars, soccer players, are not willing to spend even more on the next big technological wave hitting the world? Obviously they are. We are seeing already that the Silicon Valley grip on this particular technology is not as strong as you would have thought. Pretty much every entity in the world that has the funds to do it is trying to figure something around AI. And the thing about AI at the moment is that there's only a couple of bottlenecks here. If you've got the data set to work with, the data to train on, if you've got the money to buy the machines and the money to buy the scientists, so pay the scientists to come and basically train those machines, the AI system on those machines, pretty much anybody in the world can do this. If you had about 10 billion or so, rand, you could probably do that in South Africa as well. That's kind of what it's going to cost you. And what's important about this is that we've got to be very careful keeping an eye on where exactly the next trend is going to come from, because you can't just rely on the fact that these are the big players in the market and this is going to be the ones that are going to win in the end of the day. This is a very quick, very fluctuating market. This is a very, volatile, flexible, kind of, innovative market, and then you need to basically keep an eye out in terms of what you think is going to be the new thing out there. And, always be aware that, your predictions could be disrupted, like I said, in the period of a couple of days where out of nowhere, a new model comes out. But I want to keep in mind a couple other things, Understand that right now, in terms of like the models we're training out, GPT-4 still holds the top of the table. It was released about 6 months ago. In fact, I think next week will be 6 months that it was released. By December this year, we should get Gemini from Google. That is going to be maybe 4 to 5 times larger than GPT-4. And from history, that usually translates into a whole different class of abilities. Not just that you can do things faster or better. There's new things you can do that GPT-4 wouldn't be able to do. Next year, by the second quarter of next year, so we're talking about before June, July in 2024, a new set of chips are going to be released by NVIDIA that are going to be roughly an order of magnitude. It's about 10 times more useful for training AI models than the current set of chips are. So by next year, we're going to have 10 times more ability to train these models than we have currently. And so can you imagine something that is trained on the current system that's 5 times bigger, doing the same training next year on something that's 10 times more powerful? So you're talking maybe something 50 times bigger by the end of next year in terms of what's available, 50 times bigger than GPT-4. That is just the start of it. We're talking about much more money coming into play. The amount of money in AI in 2025 is roughly going to be more than double, 2.5 times roughly, what was put into in 2022. So the amount of money being spent here is up. The amount of computer power per unit of money spent is up. Interest is up around the world. Data is more available than we thought it was. And finally, algorithms are increasing as well. I mean, in the last decade or so, the number of papers on AI is basically equivalent to all previous time combined. The amount of papers in the last 10 years or so on AI is more than all years before 2012, I think it was, or 2013. So we have better software, likely because the papers that are written are often to do with algorithms. We have much better hardware, as obviously known, and we have much more money going into these things. And so, like I said, don't be surprised that within, say, in 2024, at least by 2025, we will have systems 40, 50 times more powerful than GPT-4. And again, I can always use this example, and it might not be exactly viable, but it is something interesting to look at. The difference between your brain and chimp's brain is roughly 3 times. And like I said, we're going to have something 5 times bigger than GPT-4 by this year, and maybe something 10 times bigger than that in the next 2 years. Okay, so we're talking about something 50 times bigger than GPT-4 within 2025 or so. 3 times human to chimp. What does 50 times do? When looking at GPT-4 being as amazing as it was 6 months ago, what does something 50 times more powerful than that do? Okay, keep that in mind when you think about AI and what to do going forward. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.